Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event. My name is Jim Nicell. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering. I guess I'll be playing a little bit of your host and a bit of the MC tonight. First of all, before we get started, just remind you again, we still unfortunately are under COVID-like conditions. And so we really ask people to respect social distancing norms as well as maintain your mask on. Of course, you can drink your water, take it on, but please keep your mask on as much as humanly possible. As always, we have a tradition here now, fortunately, of acknowledging the land that we are on. I want to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. We thank the diverse Indigenous peoples for the fact that we, from all walks and parts of the world and walks of life, can gather on this site to exchange ideas on how to cultivate and foster a better future for all. This invitation to Lorne came via me based on a presentation that Lorne gave to the Canadian Academy of Engineering in 2021. I thought it was a very, very well-received presentation because it really stimulated people to think about some of the major challenges facing humanity with a different perspective. So for those of you who don't know Mr. Lorne Trottier, I should actually call you Dr. Lorne Trottier. Lorne has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Electrical Engineering from McGill University, earned in 1970, and a master's 3 years later, also in Electrical Engineering from McGill. And because of his many contributions, both as an innovator, an engineer, a business person, and for his profound commitment to our faculty, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2006. The company that Lorne founded, Matrox, many of you may have seen it as you drive down Highway 40 on a regular basis, is really quite an amazing company. Founded in 1976, somehow, despite the death of many companies who, in a very competitive environment, don't manage to stay afloat, he has managed to keep this company going and growing and innovating at every step of the way since 1976. This is not a small achievement in any way. So Lorne, in this company, which was very focused on innovative products in the areas of video graphics for television and the AV industries, also shifted over into machine vision and factory automation industries. But Lorne isn't defined by his business. Lorne, I can also say, is defined by a whole wide range of interests that he has. That is, including his interest and his capacity in technology development. He has incredible interests spanning the areas of climate change, energy, astronomy, and aerospace science. I call them an interest. It's not the right term. They're a commitment. Lorne seems to dive into everything with full gusto and full commitment. So I could say I'm going to characterize these as deep commitments that Lorne has made to translating, I guess, the immense success that he's had as a business person, as an entrepreneur, as an innovator, into major contributions that support the broader community. So if there's one thing I can always say of Lorne, is that he's always pushing the boundaries. He's pushing on the boundaries of the technologies that he's providing through his company. But he's also challenging us to push our boundaries as well, and he's making that possible. So in fact, he's pushed our boundaries in areas including science education and literacy, science-informed public policy, astronomy, astrophysics, aerospace engineering, healthcare, and of course, sustainable development. And particularly with an incredibly strong commitment to addressing the climate emergency that is facing all of us right now. And he's doing this by supporting concrete actions taken in academia, in business, and in a larger city. It's only fair, it's only just, it's only right to take somebody like Lorne and give him the opportunity, or I guess to create the opportunity for us to hear what he has to share on his perspectives on climate change and the challenges that face us in the 21st century. He did this for the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and we're very happy to have him here tonight to share his perspectives on those subjects. Lorne, over to you.
Well, oops, here we go. This is the right spot. Thank you, Jim, for those very kind words. I'm a kind of a geek at heart, and I love all kinds of things: technology, as you'll soon see, space science, and climate change, and a whole bunch of other things. So my talk today is basically a personal perspective on climate change and 21st century challenges. I'm opening this talk with one of the most famous space pictures ever taken, this picture of the Earth from the moon, taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts, who were the first people to orbit the moon. And the immortal words of the commander of Apollo 8, he said, we were sent to explore the moon, but instead we discovered the Earth. And this picture became one of the foundation pictures for the modern environmental movement, because it shows the beautiful Earth in the cold darkness of space. And it's our only home, and a home that we need to protect. So I think, as Jim mentioned, one of my passions and interests is in astronomy and space science, and you'll get a little taste of that towards the end of this presentation. Let me see if this thing works. Oops. Uh-oh. Not advancing here. Why not? There it is. Okay. All right. The next slide, please. So my perspective on climate change and the challenges facing us can best be summarized by this quote, famous quote from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. There's both positive and negative things happening at the same time. So the quote is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. So that somewhat schizophrenic view of the world, or plus and minus, is kind of what I'm going to be, my perspective on things, which I'll be explaining. Next slide, please. So some of the negatives and the positives are best reflected in a couple of books that I've read in recent years. One of them is called Factfulness by the late Hans Rosling, who was a medical doctor, a professor of international health, and a renowned public educator. And the other one, Enlightenment Now, by Steven Pinker, who's a professor at Harvard, but he's a Montrealer, and he graduated from McGill University, so I take a little pride in him. So here are some quotes from this book, Factfulness, which tells how many people perceive the problems of the world today. Some of these quotes say, okay, think about the world. We hear about war, violence, natural disasters, man-made disasters, corruption. Things are bad, and it feels like they're getting worse, right? The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the number of poor keeps increasing, and we will all soon run out of resources unless we do something drastic. At least that's the picture that most Westerners see in the media and carry around in their heads. Rosling calls this the overdramatic worldview. It's stressful and somewhat misleading. Here's some other quotes from Factfulness where he gives what he thinks is the reality. In fact, the vast majority of the world's population lives somewhere in the middle of the income spectrum. Perhaps they're not what we think of as middle class, but they're not living in extreme poverty. Their girls go to school, their children get vaccinated, except for COVID-19. This was written before COVID, but eventually. Many of them want to travel, but not as refugees. Step by step, year by year, the world is improving, as we'll soon see. Not on every single measure, not every single year, but as a rule. Though the world faces huge challenges, we have made tremendous progress. This is the fact-based worldview, according to Rosling. Steven Pinker, the Montrealer, now professor at Harvard, Since the Enlightenment unfolded in the late 18th century, life expectancy across the world has risen from 30 to 71, and in the more fortunate countries to 81 years of age. When the Enlightenment began, a third of the children born in the richest parts of the world died before their 5th birthday. Today, that fate befalls 6% of children in the poorest countries. The world is about 100 times wealthier today than it was 2 centuries ago, and prosperity is becoming more evenly distributed across the world's countries and people. The proportion of humanity living in extreme poverty has fallen from almost 90% to less than 10%. And within the lifetimes of most of the people in this room anyway, it could approach 0. As people are getting healthier, richer, safer, and freer, they're also becoming more literate, knowledgeable, and smarter. Early in the 19th century, 12% of the world could read and write. Today, 83% can. So those are some of the positives. And here's some comments from people who've reviewed these books. So this first one is from Bill Gates, one of the most important books I've ever read about Factfulness by Rosling. According to Nature, Factfulness throws down a gauntlet to doom and gloomers in global health by challenging preconceptions and misconceptions. And from Enlightenment Now, again, Bill Gates, Enlightenment Now, the book is not only the best book Pinker has ever written, it's my new favorite book of all time. According to Science magazine, Pinker makes a powerful case that the main line of history has been, since the Enlightenment, one of improvement. Scientific American said, a magisterial new book, Enlightenment Now is the most uplifting work of science I've ever read. So, let's see here. What are some of the facts here? Well, actually, I forgot to ask you to advance the slides, so sorry about that. Could just jump to the slide where it starts with 1800 at the top. I read most of those. There we go. Okay. So these graphs, just go back here a second. Yeah. So the following slides that I'm going to be showing you here, they present evidence to support this best of times worldview. Most of the graphs were taken from a website called Gapminder Statistics. And most of the data used by Gapminder comes from various international UN agencies such as UNICEF, UN Population Fund, World Health Organization, etc. This data is pre-pandemic. The pandemic will have made some of these numbers a little bit worse, but as history has shown, these will likely be temporary setbacks. So we just skip ahead. We're on 1800s. Okay. Okay. So this graph from 1800 shows the distribution of life expectancy and income. So income is on the x-axis, and life expectancy is on the y-axis. Oops, back to 1800, I'm sorry. That's it, that's what I went to, okay. So, and the color, it's color-coded by region. So red represents Asian country, yellow represents European countries. Each dot and the size of it represents roughly the population of the country in relation to other countries. And there are 4 income levels on the graph. I don't know if you can see that, but there's like 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not sure it shows up there, but 1 is the extreme poverty, and 4 is getting to the right-hand side, relatively wealthy. And in this particular, at that time, 1800, according to this graph, 89% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. Average life expectancy in the world was around 30 years. Life was nasty, brutish, and short for most of the world's population in the year 1800. Next slide. So in 1900, we see that some of those dots have moved up and to the right. Let me switch here, okay. So most of the improvements we're seeing here are the yellow dots, which were the Western countries. And there were improvements in life expectancy due to things like sanitation and clean drinking water. There was also increase in wealth somewhere in the Western countries due to the Industrial Revolution. But still in the year 1900, 71% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. Next slide. Jumping ahead to 1960, we can see further substantial improvements in both life expectancy and income in Western countries. But there's a big divergence between Western countries and most of the world. More than half the world's population still lived in extreme poverty, particularly in Asia and Africa. The two biggest laggards, the two big red dots there, are China and India. Opinion polls nowadays show that most people still hold this view, that there's this huge disparity between the West and everywhere else. But 1960 actually marked a major shift that happened. Next slide, please. So this shows the situation in 2000. Improvements in income and life expectancy have started to spread, particularly to China and India. And the percentage of the world's population living in extreme poverty had dropped to 25%. Next slide, please. And in 2018, we see a further improvement. China in particular has moved firmly into middle income territory. African countries have advanced in life expectancy, but still lag on income. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty in 2018 had dropped to about 10%, according to these statistics. So this particular graph here shows how literacy has changed in the 20th century. You can see it actually goes back a few centuries, but you see that since 1800 anyway, the rates of literacy in the world have gone up dramatically. In the 1800, as I mentioned earlier, I forget what the number was, but it might have been 20% of the world's population could read and write. Today, it's well over 70% of the world's population, and so literacy is a good indication of basic education. So education standards worldwide have increased dramatically. That's one of the things that's gotten better. Next slide, please. This is another graph showing things related to education. So this graph is showing, the top part is kids that are around 15 years, what percentage of them are still in school or in school. And you can see that the numbers have gone up also significantly across most of the world. So literacy was around 12% in 1820, and globally it's 82% in 2010, which is as far as this graph goes. Next slide, please. Here's another important metric, which is fertility. We hear a lot about population growth, but in fact, the rate of growth of the world's population is slowing down dramatically, and population experts predict that world's population will eventually peak at around 11 billion people by the end of this century, but it'll decline after that. Many countries in the world have birth rates below their replacement levels. Populations will decline. This shows in certain developing countries how fertility rates decline. You see South Korea, the number of children per woman or whatever, 5.6 to 1.3 from 1960 to 2015. And a number of those other countries, it's pretty dramatic changes. And so these drops in fertility rate are highly correlated with increased life expectancy, increased income, and increased in education. Those are the factors that they're correlated with, and something that population experts haven't seen consistently everywhere. Next slide, please. So this particular graph shows projections for the world's population. You can see the middle one anyway levels off at about 11 billion, but that's the consensus projection for how population will go. Next slide. So these previous slides, they make the case for what I call the best of times. You know, life expectancy, incomes, levels of education, and so on, population growth and all that are all moderating and people are becoming healthier, wealthier, living longer, and so on. So that trend is likely to continue because it's based on modern science and technology and modern health, so on. And the knowledge for all those things is spreading around the world. And as it spreads, it's resulting in improved living conditions for the world as a whole. However, we do have some very serious problems as well. Climate change, in my opinion, being the worst one, but there are quite a few of them. And climate change in particular, if we don't deal with it properly, could set us back, could knock us back 200 years, to the worst of times. And this is only partly a technological issue, because most of the solutions to climate change technologically, we already see them, but it's also cultural and political. And as educated people, which all of you here being at McGill are, we have a duty to try to push our societies to move in the right direction to deal with these problems. So me personally, next slide, please. Yeah. As Jim said, I'm a successful entrepreneur, and with some of the wealth I've generated, we've created the Trottier Family Foundation. We've been very active in many of these issues. To date, we've made investments of about 40 million to deal with climate change issues on various fronts, and we're increasing our budget to at least 8 million a year to 2030 to try to incentivize action on climate change. I'll give you an idea of some of the things that we've done, but most of the credit goes to people who run our foundation, Eric St. Pierre, our executive director, and Laura Butler, who's also a very key person running the thing. So I'll just give you some idea some of the things we've done. So one of the first big things we did was what's called the Trottier Energy Futures Project. Next slide, please. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there it is. So this was a partnership between the David Suzuki Foundation, a well-known environmental group, and the Canadian Academy of Engineering, which I'm a member, and an engineer. And this was the first major study where we actually used models, economic and energy models of Canada, to try to model how Canada could reduce greenhouse gases by up to 80% by 2050. And it was the first study of its kind that was really tried to use a rigorous set of modeling to try to study that for Canada anyway. And because it was the first of its kind, the Canadian government actually used it at one of these climate meetings back in 2016. They didn't have one their own. But anyway, one of the key conclusions from this thing was that decarbonization, not a big surprise, decarbonization of the electricity sector, generating electricity with clean energy, and then using electricity as the prime energy source for things like transportation, buildings, industrial processes, and so on. This would be the biggest lever you could use to reduce greenhouse emissions. That was a prime conclusion from that study. Next slide. We also applied the modeling capability that we have fund for the Suzuki project, the Trottier Energy Futures project, to Montreal. Our foundation worked with the city of Montreal to use modeling to try to model how Montreal could reduce its greenhouse gases. And the city of Montreal came out with a plan. I forget which year it was, a couple of years ago, December 2020, actually, for the city to reduce its climate impact. And they used some of the modeling we did to help them make that plan. Next slide. We're also involved with a group called the Low Carbon Cities Canada. We teamed up with another foundation located in Toronto called the Toronto Atmospheric Fund. And the Toronto Atmospheric Fund has developed a model where they have an endowment of funds that they use to help kickstart building retrofits programs to make buildings more energy efficient. And we and them and a few other people lobbied the federal government, and the government came through with a grant of $183 million to fund similar initiatives across Canada, including one that we've set up here in Montreal that we call the Greater Montreal Climate Fund. So we're working with the city on things like that. We also, our foundation worked with other like-minded foundations to establish an organization called Efficiency Canada, which is a national voice for promoting energy efficiency. We funded, among others, the Eco-Fiscal Commission, which was based here at McGill, actually under the direction of Professor Chris Reagan, who runs the School of Public Policy here at McGill now. But the work of his group led to the federal government's carbon tax, what do you want to call it, plan, largely based on the research that was conducted by the Eco-Fiscal Commission. Okay, next slide. Oops. Yeah, okay, well, actually it was behind one. Anyway, so what I just said is reflected in this slide. Sorry, a little out of sync here. Okay, next slide then. We've also been involved in responsible investing. Our foundation has divested from fossil fuels, and we're active in, voting whenever their shareholder proxy votes and so on, make sure that companies follow sustainable practices. So, next slide. So I could go on. We're involved in many, many activities, but I think you get the point that we should all do what we can. And certainly our foundation is doing what we can to deal with the climate crisis. And every educated person should be joining this very important endeavor. So I'll just, one final thought here, being an entrepreneur. Many people see capitalism, or what I like to call it free enterprise, as a major cause of the world's problems, things like income inequality and climate change. But as the first part of my presentation made clear, I think, the huge increase in global welfare over the past 200 years is in fact due in large part to the wealth that's been created by private enterprise, by free enterprise. So I think that's important. Free enterprise continues to increase living standards and continues to create most of the technological solutions that we're going to use to solve the climate crisis. So the problem of income inequality, it does exist, particularly in the richer countries. But as we saw, on the whole, the world has gotten a lot wealthier. But the problem of income inequality in rich countries and so on can be solved through things like fairer taxation and other measures, but not by killing the golden goose. So it's a little plug for that. So all of us including responsible capitalists, want to preserve our planet. Okay. So in closing, I'd like to do a quote from Carl Sagan, who's one of my science heroes. I don't know, you were probably too young to know who he was, but he was a very, very effective and popularizer of science to the public. And he wrote this thing that he called the pale blue dot, which is the Earth as seen from space. But before I read that, I'm just going to show you a few of my favorite pictures of the Earth from space. So this is the one that we started the presentation with, the famous Earthrise, seen by Apollo 8, which became one of the iconic images of the environmental movement. This picture was actually taken from Mars. The Mars Climate Orbiter has a powerful telephoto lens on it, and it was aimed from Mars orbit at the Earth and the Moon, and it caught them in this picture. Next slide. This picture, that you can see a pale blue dot just below Saturn's rings. That's the Earth. And that was taken by the Cassini orbiter that orbited Saturn for, I don't know, about 10, 20 years. And it took many, many pictures of Saturn and its moons, but they took some time out to photograph the Earth from all the way out there. Pale blue dot. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. So anyway, I kind of like that quote. So we do need to protect our home. It's the only one we have, or ever will have, and it's a fragile place. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
You won't go far. We'd like to open up, if Lorne, if you're okay, open up with an opportunity for the group to ask any questions you may have. We have a microphone centered in the middle of the room, so anybody have any questions you'd like Mr. Trottier to answer for you? Please, go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much for those that very thoughtful presentation. Great quotes.
Thank you.
So from my perspective, it seems like the solution to climate change is not that complicated. It's basically we have to stop burning fossil fuels, and if we want to maintain the high standard of living, as you point out, we need to maintain a high rate of energy supply. So we simply have to build non-fossil fuel energy infrastructure. We just need to build solar panels, we need to build windmills, and we need to build all of the connections so that we can supply all that electricity through the grid and electrify the system.
Right.
Right. So it's a straightforward problem. It should be able to make lots of money. It's a huge employment opportunity for millions of people. It should be a great thing for private enterprise to take up if properly incentivized. So from your perspective, why is it not happening faster?
It's a very important and difficult question. You know,
I know it's I don't know the answer. I was just wondering. I would love to hear your perspective on it.
You know, I mean, one of the problems, particularly in the U.S., that we can see right next door are is political polarization. You know, the society's become very, very, very polarized, and a lot of people have become fixed in certain ideological positions and aren't listening. And I don't know, I'm not sure how you're going to break that log jam, but we've got to keep trying. But, you know, I think that it does require, you know, democratic will in democratic countries to really deal with that. And, you know, we see even in Canada, we have certain provinces that derive a lot of wealth from fossil fuels that are very reluctant to give that up. And, you know, so it's a political problem. What can I say? But you're right. I mean, the solutions, they're not that complicated. And, you know, continued innovation, you know, will continue to bring prices down. You know, like, I'm sure you're aware that the cost of wind and solar energy has plummeted drastically over the last decade. Electric cars are becoming much more affordable. So the solutions are visible. It just our people have to have the desire to go with it.
Other questions? Please.
Yeah, perhaps a follow-up question, comment on that. The stars are getting aligned in terms of the renewable energy is now competitive with fossil fuels, etc. And yet it seems like the stakeholders, I mean, for example, we have in this province, our power utility is the government, or is part of the government, but it seems to be timid in the way that we know that if we want to replace fossil fuels, you can make a quick calculation, we need to triple or quadruple our electricity production in a relatively short time. So you'd think, okay, this is time to invest, this is the time to be aggressive, this is the time to move, and even the industry leaders in the fossil fuels, not in the fossil fuel, in the renewables seem to be timid. And I can understand that 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's now, and perhaps people just haven't grasped, in the same way that we haven't grasped that we live in a better world, we haven't grasped that the situation has now changed enough that we're on the cusp of at least a very possible, very rapid shift. Mm-hmm. And this is basically what we need. So we are in a time when we need a rapid shift, and mm-hmm. at the same time, we're in a time where we, I think, are almost ready mm-hmm. for a rapid shift. But people don't seem, not many people mm-hmm. seem to be moving that way. That being said, it only takes a few people to start a revolution. And perhaps that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I hope that a revolution does happen, but I do think it will require, you know, a major shift in thinking on the part of the public, a massive shift. I mean, people say that they like to deal with climate change and all that, but they're not necessarily prepared to make any meaningful personal sacrifices or whatever. I mean, paying higher prices for gas-guzzling cars, putting a big tax on gas-guzzling cars, you know, and a big tax on gasoline and so on. These are things that would drive people to, like if you take the case of Norway as a good example. I think the latest statistics I saw was that in Norway last year, I think it was 80 or 90% of new cars were electric. Why? Because in Norway, a gasoline car has a tax of 100%. So it's cheaper to drive an electric car. And so they're driving it. But anyway, it takes a little political will to do that. And politicians only have as much will as they feel they're going to get from the voters, I think.
First, thank you for blazing a trail for the government to follow. You gave some great examples of your institute just doing something and then the government like kind of copying and moving behind it. So thank you for taking that initiative. Second, I'm really enthused by the cities. So you talked about the low carbon cities project. I'm wondering if you can expand on any details that are happening in Montreal that we can be excited about and share with students and other people.
Well, I am not up on the details of that. Our foundation is run by our family, some other family members who are more deeply involved in it than I am. But I know that we helped the city come up with this climate plan, and we also got some money from the federal government to establish a sort of a fund that can be invested in building retrofits and things like that to reduce emissions. But if you want some details, I could put you in touch with people from our foundation who can deal with that more. I myself still heavily involved in my company Matrox, so I spend most of my time. But I'm very supportive of what our family foundation is doing.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Trottier. Thank you for this presentation. And it's an honor being in person and listening to your presentation. So I want to say that I recognize that we made tremendous progress in terms of income, life expectancy, health. But I felt a bit resistant with the words poor and rich that were seen in the graph, because richer doesn't mean happier. Richer doesn't mean more self-actualized. Richer doesn't mean more connected. And I don't think we're in the best times in terms of humanity. I still think we're in this dark age of consciousness and self-knowledge. And that's kind of my current criticism with the current discourse in sustainability challenge, is that we're so focused on the outward that we totally overlook the inward. And when I say inward, I mean mental health, I mean personal transformation, I mean self-actualization, I mean a shift in mindset. So I was wondering, what is your perspective on that, and how can we find greater transdisciplinarity in the field of sustainability where we can integrate it with psychological science? Because sustainability is not just about making a shift on the outward, it's also about becoming better people, becoming better persons.
Well,
thank you.
I think I mean, when we talk about, human well-being, it's a very, very broad topic, and there are many, many metrics. And I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody is equally better off than they would have been. But the statistics that I'm showing you I didn't invent them. They came from these books that I read, and most of the data they cite come from UN agencies that look at these things. So these are objective facts, that there has been increases in life expectancy, increases in in income, increases in education, and so on and so forth. So all those things are good things that should improve people's mental well-being on average, but it won't do it for everybody all the time. And certainly in the time of COVID, for example, if we had those detailed graphs for the last couple of years, we'd probably see some decreases in well-being and health and so on and so forth. Which, by the way, Hans Rosling, I don't know if you caught that during the animation, there were a couple of dips in there, like the First World War and the 1918 flu epidemic, for example. There was a significant dip. So progress isn't always linear. There are setbacks, but the overall trend has been one of improvement. To me, that's very important. And as somebody who believes in the value of science and technology, I think that this is fundamentally what has driven human progress, is our increased understanding of nature, and with science and our ability to harness nature through technology is fundamentally what has driven the improvement in human well-being over the last, since the Stone Age, basically, but certainly over the last couple hundred years at an accelerating pace.
Any other questions? Yes.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. I just feel compelled to make a comment on what you said. The stats are great. Of course, we are doing much better than we did 100 years ago. But I just want to flag that even though life expectancy is increasing, In Montreal, there's still an 11-year difference in life expectancy between neighborhoods that are wealthier and those that are less. 65 years of age, an Inuit men can expect to live. There's like appalling inequalities in Canada that we have to keep in mind when we're implanting mitigation and adaptation measures, right? The decarbonization of buildings in Montreal, great. These are not necessarily going to low-income populations. If we're building greener, sustainable neighborhoods, it's gonna, jack up the housing price that are crazy at the moment. So we need to keep in mind these equity impacts that are not always present in these great initiatives that overall will improve the average, but the inequalities might increase, and we need to keep that in check.
I agree with you. We still have a lot of problems in our society, and inequality within our society is still a very serious problem. But there are various ways we can deal with that. The only one thing that I do sort of take issue with some people. Some people attack capitalism as the root cause of all evil, and I think they actually, capitalism is imperfect, that's for sure. But in terms of the economic and material progress that the world has seen over the last 200 years, I think it's undeniable that competitive enterprise is largely responsible for that. And so, a rising tide lifts all boats, but not equally. And we still have to deal with those other problems as well.
Before I ask my question, the government of Canada just announced that it's greenlighting the North Bay project in Newfoundland, which will extract 300 million barrels of oil starting in 2028. So it's kind of interesting, the presentation you made with the reality of the politics of the issue. But my question to you was, it was quite interesting when you talked about your love of science, of space, and sustainability. Could you expand on the interrelationship of both, how it plays out in your mind, and how you view these two in the short, medium, and long term?
I'm not sure what you mean, like personal space travel? Billionaires going to space for joyrides and stuff?
Yes,
is that
space travel and the fuel and all these different aspects of it.
my love of space exploration is primarily scientific and technological. The universe and the origins of the universe and the evolution, the universe and life are amongst the most awe-inspiring concepts of modern science, and I just find it thrilling to read about that and for us as a species to be learning more and more about all of that. In terms of traveling into space or whatever, I have no intention of doing that. For my personal wealth, I can see much better ways to spend the money through our foundation and some of the other work that we're doing. But those who want to do it, one of the things that has happened through technology is things that were very, very expensive at one time have become much cheaper. So space travel, I think, is on the same path. Whether it'll get cheap enough that a lot of people will do it, I don't know. But we take, the renewable energy, things like solar panels and wind turbines. Those started out very, very expensive. Costs has come down tremendously. Electric cars, costs has come down tremendously. SpaceX, the company that Elon Musk founded, along with his electric car company Tesla, has brought the cost of launching things into orbit way down, and you ain't seen nothing yet. They're working on a totally reusable rocket that will bring the cost of launching masses into space down to like 1% of what it used to be. So, technology marches on. For me, space is primarily something that I'm interested in for the science and to some extent, the adventure. I think, it'd be fantastic if within my lifetime, humans could land on Mars. That's something that I've been dreaming about since I was a student here at McGill, a long time ago. But not that everybody should go to Mars, but I think from the point of view of adventure and scientific discovery, it would be pretty awesome. We're here at McGill. We have something called the McGill Space Institute that's doing some amazing work on the frontiers of astrophysics and science. Is one of the groups that I'm proud that our foundation is helping to support. And it's pure science they're doing, nothing commercial about it.